Hello, everybody, and welcome to another snowy episode. I'm Art, ex-family scapegoat, black sheep, and the alleged forever evil character in my ex-family's story. Today, I want to talk to you guys about guilt, and not the kind that comes from doing something truly wrong and that pushes us to make things right and become a better person. I'm talking about the guilt that was planted into you, trained into you, and kept alive by a narcissistic family system, by an abusive family member, perhaps a parent, who shaped you since you were a child. And I'm talking about the guilt that sits in your body and lingers, on and on and on and on without any resolution, sort of keeping you under somebody else's control, because that's what it really does. And this type of guilt shows up when you do normal, healthy things, like setting boundaries, for example, like saying no to protect yourself, like stating a preference, a dislike, a like, speaking up when you're uncomfortable, or when you reduce contact with someone who hurt you and disrespected you over and over and over and over again. You were trained in your upbringing to believe that these healthy acts are not normal, that those healthy, normal acts are hurtful, and that protecting yourself somehow harms people, harms the people who claim that they love you. And I'm going to address that in a second, because it's very, the guilt makes those lines so blurry. It blurs what love actually really is. And this guilt convinces you that you're a terrible human being, that I'm a terrible human being, and that we are together the most awful, evil human beings on the planet. And for what? For what? For existing? For being who we are? For protecting ourselves? For saying no? Now, for many of us who grew up as the family scapegoat, this guilt becomes a part of our wiring. It follows us well into adulthood and never, ever, ever stops. It turns our default mindset into like a belief that we are either always too much or never enough. Has that ever happened to you? Because that was sort of, the background hum of my entire upbringing. I'm too much or I'm not enough. It's never a healthy middle ground. And it shows up in our relationships. It makes us overgive, overwork, and overexplain. It drains our mental health. It teaches us to tolerate what hurts. It convinces us to shrink, to make ourselves really, really, really small, even in spaces where we should be feeling safe and we can express ourselves safely. This guilt appears every time that you try and create a safety bubble for yourself, and tells you to go back where you came from, even if that place and those people keep hurting you, keep sabotaging you, keep preventing you from self-actualizing. Now, today, we're going to talk about what it takes to break that spell and start living from your truth instead of from your conditioning. And I want to give you guys a quick heads up. My style of teaching is to share my experiences and my emotional processing as the ex-family scapegoat who has got no contact. And I do this in the hopes that you will feel validated and seen. I want you to know that I speak from a place of safety. Nothing I say is theoretical. It comes from lived experience and years of working through the trauma and the aftermath of being my mother's scapegoat. And I hope that these talks give you guys the strength, the clarity, and the courage to do whatever you need to do for your well-being. Now, undoing this kind of conditioning is not a 5-minute fix. It requires inner work, self-awareness, and this really painful acceptance that even though you were abused, you will always be the bad guy in their eyes. You will always be that bad guy to the people that make up your narcissistic family system. In my experience, this is an image of you that they will never let go of, no matter how well you're doing, no matter how successful you are, no matter how kind you are, no matter how well you're doing, they will never let that go. They will always talk down to you as if you're the one who destroyed the entire family, as if you're the one who tore everything apart by speaking your truth and by protecting yourself. Because why, oh, why can't you just keep your mouth shut so that everything can just continue going the way it always has and everyone is happy? Okay. And they will bring up incidents from your childhood, from your teenage years, at times that you acted out, times where you were vulnerable, times where they helped you, but that help came with conditions. And they will bring those up, to prove to you and to sort of, keep you on a leash of these forever mistakes that will never be forgiven and that will be used for the rest of your life to justify, their treatment of you and the role that they're forcing upon you. You will never get their permission to have peace. Even if you scream, if you cry, if you show them a doctor's notes, if you write a letter, never mind the incidents in which you were physically and psychologically and emotionally destroyed by this family member, and sometimes they witnessed it, in their narrative, you shouldn't feel anything about it. And there is always justification for the bullying that you went through. Or it never happened, even though it did. They'll say that it didn't. They will change the story. Or they will also tell you that your abuser is suffering so much that they can't help abusing you. And if you loved your family, you would take more abuse like a champion with a smile, even though you're actually becoming physically sick from these dynamics and the role that you are forced to play in your family. They will tell you you're not strong enough. They will call you weak for being sick, for being traumatized, for being unable to tolerate more abuse. And they teach you that if you don't tolerate abuse, you're a bad person and therefore you should be feeling guilty. So, in their mindset, and this is my personal experience, instead of getting that person who's hurting you, who's showing, that they have a problem, they clearly have a problem, instead of getting that person professional help or holding them accountable, they rather keep you within their reach, so that you can continue being their emotional trash can, so that the system can just keeps on going the way it always has. So the rational thing to do for them is to deny, deflect, and shame the family scapegoat because another family member can't regulate their own emotions. They refuse to admit that they have a problem. They refuse treatment for their personality disorder. So the rational thing to do is to, blame the scapegoat for triggering, the abusive parent. And the reason why they abuse you is because you keep triggering them. Is this sound familiar to you guys? Guilt within the family scapegoat serves a very important function. It basically stabilizes the chaos, of the entire family by keeping their emotional trash can, which is you and me, compliant. And as long as we continue to feel guilty, they will feel like their abuses are justified. Because we feel guilty, therefore we are bad, therefore their behavior is justified. If you fight back, if you decide that you will not be the scapegoat anymore, the entire system actually destabilizes, and that perfect family image that they try so hard to maintain completely dissolves, right? So they will do everything in their power to keep you in place. And to do this, they will use your own emotions against you. They will use your feelings against you. They will use your empathy against you. They will use your values against you. And if that doesn't work, then come the smear campaigns and the flying monkeys and the people that try and bring you back to that dynamic. And throughout the whole thing, you will have morality, talks of forgiveness. You'll be accused of judging. You'll be accused of all sorts of things that aren't true. And every single thing is really, I think, designed to trigger your guilt and to make you feel like you don't have values, like you're an evil person. Now, if we go back in time, for a little bit, if you think back, to the first time that you felt really incredibly guilty in your life, what image comes to mind? The first time that you felt guilty for speaking up, for sharing a preference, for doing something that actually your adult mind today knows, well, this is not something that's wrong. It's just you stating a preference. If you go back, and think back about this, you will find a pattern. It starts with a story told about you that was not accurate. It's them reminding you over and over and over that you're undeserving of their love. It's the constant antagonism that pushes you to react, followed by everyone making you feel like you're horrible for reacting to what you were put through in the first place. The child who learns to feel guilty for existing becomes an adult who feels guilty for living. And this is not theoretical, this is embodied. It becomes a reflex in our nervous system. So conditioned guilt is emotional obedience. It's the internal training that you received since toddlerhood. So if you want to understand conditioned guilt, we have to look at its roots. Look at your life. Look at the behavior of the adults who raised you. I can tell you, I'll share with you my earliest memory of this guilt, which had no real reason to be there, when I was a small child. I remember being absolutely terrified of telling my mother my food preferences. I was a very small child at the time, and that was the earliest memory that I have. Is I remember she often served this bun, this bread sort of bun, that I really didn't like. I didn't like the texture of that bread bun thing, and I really preferred plain toast. And I remember dreading, really being terrified of telling her that I actually didn't like that bread and that I preferred toast. And when I finally got the courage to say it, and I remember being at the table and her serving me the thing and me going, okay, I'm going to tell her that I actually don't like this bread and I hope she's not hurt. I just remember feeling so much anxiety about that, and Mom, I actually don't like this kind of bread, I prefer toast. And I remember her voice, the tone that changed instantly. And it was this shocked, wounded voice that she used whenever I had a need or a thought or a preference that was different from what she liked or whatever she wanted, And it was like, you don't like this bread, and when you're a child, that sort of facial expression is terrifying, And that was followed by a speech of how ungrateful I was and how I did not appreciate anything that she did for me and how she slaved for me and all this stuff and how evil and da 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 da. And then, of course, the fights ensued and so on, And that voice, that was the soundtrack of my entire childhood, Every preference I had that did not align with her led to conflict 100%. The bread, a dress, a hobby, a school program I wanted to get into, a friend I chose, it never mattered how small or harmless it was. And every one of those choices, that I wanted to make for myself that was different from what she wanted, always led to this emotional explosion. Oh, you make your mother suffer. You don't like this after all the hard work I did for you, you ungrateful monster. You don't like this dress I picked out for you. You don't want to wear that to school. Fine. Wear your stupid, ugly clothes and look like a boy and have everybody laugh at you. Or your father cooked today and you compliment his food. How dare you compliment his food? You like your father's food? Fine. I will never cook for you again because no one appreciates my work. It was, when you really think back, when you really look as an adult at these things, it's ridiculous how the smallest, tiniest thing, which is just a preference, it's just a choice, it's just some, you're learning, I like this, I don't like this. That's just a part of growing up and learning to be human. And the smallest things like this, they become so weaponized against you that you start feeling guilty just for having preferences that are separate from the narcissistic parent. You feel guilty for being a different person with different likes and dislikes. You feel guilty because the narcissistic parent, it needs emotional fusion and punishes individuality. They don't want you to be an individual. They want you to be fused and meshed with them, you know? And the child who learns that their authentic self is wrong grows into an adult who feels guilty for every step towards their own autonomy. Think about that. You start feeling guilty for wanting to have your own space, for wanting to have your independence, for wanting to, just start making decisions that are good for you. You feel guilty every single decision that you make for yourself is a guilty one if you don't include your narcissistic parent's opinion, okay? And in my preteen and early teenage years, that conditioning deepened even more because I was my mother's emotional support system. So every day I had to be her nurse and her psychologist. And she forced me to sit with her while she told me every detail about how her life was horrible and how everything is evil and how the world is horrible. And it was this very dark talk all the time. It was always dark, And looking back now, I can see that this was untreated illness, But the illness was multiplied by her narcissism, and everyone enabled her. No adult did anything to intervene. They actually left me alone with the house with a very sick woman to raise me, which she didn't raise me. It was the other way around. I had to be the one taking care of her while nobody else was home. And if I didn't soothe her correctly, if I failed at my role of being her personal assistant, her psychologist, her nurse, then came the physical, psychological, and emotional abuse, with her victimhood narrative intensifying to a level that actually left me crawling on my knees for forgiveness. When I was a young teen and a child, I would crawl at my knees, and beg her for forgiveness for things I didn't even know what I did. But I just remember her with her arms crossed, looking away and, and just getting up and completely pretending that I didn't exist, and she could do this for weeks sometimes. And when I became older, her silent treatments could last months. And oftentimes those silent treatments followed her physical abuses of me. And I was still the one crawling for forgiveness after she would, physically abuse me and psychologically dismantle me, So here we learn that our needs make people suffer. Our needs, are things that we should feel guilty about, Our needs are things that hurt relationships, okay? Because only the other person's needs matter. And only appeasing somebody else matters. And if we don't do that, then we are bad, okay? And this is learned in our system, this is embedded in our nervous system. And now moving towards my teenage years and early adulthood, after an entire childhood, and pre-teenagehood and young teenagehood, trapped in an isolated home with a mentally ill woman, obviously, I did not do well. Some people do well in school. I did not. I started to avoid my home like a plague because I could not take the constant fighting and chaos anymore. Not just directed at me, but also if my father would come home, there was huge epic fights, like really, really huge epic fights. And it was such a chaotic house. And it was always so dark and so heavy, And so I turned to weed and cigarettes and alcohol and psychedelics and, physically intense sports too, like boxing. And I was training, really hard and fighting sports, and I skipped school very often. And I didn't have family or guidance or support during that time whatsoever. I was very scattered. And I knew when I would go home that the only person waiting for me was my antagonistic mother, just waiting to erupt at the next thing she invented. So I acted out, and I fought back, and I talked back, and I became less available, and I became reactive. And I numbed my feelings, just to make it through another day at that house. We had a dog, and I tell you, that dog went for a lot of walks, because every time I went to smoke a joint like every hour or something, because I just to numb myself, and so that phase of my life, which was a predictable response to the environment that I grew up in, became my family's lifelong weapon. That phase of my teenage years was the go-to leverage everyone in my family would use as a reference and as proof of my bad character for the rest of my life. It was a justification for every abuse that my mother inflicted on me from that point onwards. Never mind what led up to that. That was the only thing that they look at. They will take, your natural reactions to trauma when you're a teenager, and they will call you oppositional. They will label you as being problematic, and as, in my case, I was labeled as the evil character, the bad character that deserved what she got. And I know that even if she had nothing on me when she would erupt at me, if she was losing an argument, her default move was always the same. It's returning to my teenage years. Even when I was in my late 30s, she would go back and talk to me about something I did when I was like 15. She attacked every vulnerable moment. She replayed every mistake. She pushed guilt into my body until it overwhelmed me so much. And the narrative always circled back to those years, because she needed me to feel guilty so that she could control me, so that she could continue to control me. And, continue to use me as her personal supply instead of having a genuine, healthy relationship with me. It's always about control for them. They don't understand healthy, genuine, free relationships. They don't understand that healthy relationships are all about the freedom to be yourself. And we are made to feel so terrible for fighting back in the only ways we knew, how to do it at the time, given our age and the circumstances of our upbringing. No one asked, what was going on? Why was I acting out? Why was I never home? What was I doing when I wasn't home? There was only blame and accusation. And then this is how the guilt fog is born. And as this gets normalized, we get sicker and sicker and sicker, and the trauma compounds. We are pushed through, their antagonism, their gaslighting, their denials of what happened. And when we try to set boundaries, they revert to the mistakes we made, or the times when we were vulnerable. They will remind us over and over again of all the help they ever gave us, even though that help actually came with abuse and conditions, terrible conditions, and we become traumatized in ways that really shape our entire lives. And this leads to the next layer. We're conditioned to feel guilty for our own suffering. We are conditioned to feel guilty for our own suffering. We're conditioned to feel guilty for how we feel inside the system. The narcissist's emotional world always takes priority. It doesn't matter that the scapegoat is collapsing. It doesn't matter that the scapegoat was a child when it began, and that, their behavior was shaped by childhood and onwards. It doesn't matter that the scapegoat is being drained dry. And the entire system normalizes this dynamic. I have told you guys this before, and I say it again. The enablers cause so much more damage, than the narcissist. Because if I think back about my life, if one person, and one adult, my father or my big brother, had held the narcissist accountable, have gotten me out of there, if they would have taken what I was saying seriously, and, maybe given the narcissist a clear ultimatum to get professional treatment, and also to not make me feel guilty for setting boundaries for myself, but just, okay, yeah, we understand you need space, protect yourself, right? Our lives would have been So different, if we would have had some sort of protection. But that's not what happens, and this is why the guilt becomes so toxic and so heavy, because the whole thing becomes completely normalized. And when I was still struggling with guilt, one of the big things that I found really difficult was the shock, the realization that, yeah, this is real. These dynamics are real. There's this disbelief, sort of mixed with shock, that lived within me. Like, I couldn't actually believe it, that my family was actually this dysfunctional, that, my father actually wasn't who I imagined that he was, that my brother wasn't who I imagined that he was, and my mother as well in the early years. There's this shock and this disbelief that what you're experiencing is actually true. This belief that we truly don't matter to our family, that they don't really love us. It's hard, because every once in a while also we'll get this scarce memory, some euphoric moment, some good day that we had, something to hold on to, a time that you sat down with a family member and had a nice conversation, something that sort of triggers that, maybe they did love me somewhere in there, maybe they did, but they just didn't know how to show it. They didn't know better, right? But the thing is that two things can be true at the same time, and they don't carry the same weight. We matter as human beings. That's just a fact. You matter, I matter in the moral sense, right? The existential sense, the human sense. You matter because you exist. You matter because you have a conscience, you have a heart, and you are a part of that system. You are a family member, But the emotional structure of a narcissistic parent and their co-enabler parent, and whoever, golden child sibling, whoever jumps on that boat, it's actually impossible for them to care in a way that mattering requires. And this is the painful truth. A parent can value the idea of you or the role you play in their life, but not care about your inner world. They can enjoy the identity of being a parent, but have no capacity of empathy towards you at the same time, or accountability, or repair. They can depend on you for whatever, but not protect you when they should, or not love you, not reciprocate the love unconditionally. If we matter to them the way healthy parents care about their children, their behavior would reflect it. They would show empathy. They would show accountability. They would have interest in our emotional experience. They would protect us instead of minimizing or dismissing us. They would show remorse when they hurt us. They would prioritize the relationship over appeasing a narcissist, or being right all the time, or just, being right just so that they don't have to face what they did. They would never use us as a relief system, as an emotional trash can. They would never allow for the things that happened to happen. I mean, if there really was unconditional, genuine love in the family, none of that would have actually happened or been allowed to happen. Now, I can tell you, I stopped feeling guilt towards my main abuser, which was my mother, years ago. But letting go of my father, which was, the co-parent, the enabler, I always thought that he was the good parent, the one who did not actively harm me in obvious ways. And I spoke about this in previous videos, though. As I explained before, the good parent actually adopts an abusive mindset as well, because their role is to stay bound to the narcissistic partner, regardless of what's happening in the house or to the children. So that means they appease the narcissist, even if it hurts their own children, to try and maintain sort of some peace in the house, right? And their contribution to the abuse is actually very real. It's just much more subtle. Remember, guys, we have projections too. Our need to have a healthy parent can be projected on the least abusive parent or family member, even though they can contribute to the family dysfunction and do nothing to protect us. Okay, we have projections too. And one of the most insidious things they will do to trigger our guilt is to play with our values, making us feel like we're bad people. I mean, I remember my mother once mocking me at the table, telling everybody that I wasn't family oriented, And the irony of that statement, it was so striking to me, because the most important thing to me is my children, my husband, my animals. I mean, I cherish my family very deeply, And as a scapegoat, you're often forced to act against your values just to protect yourself, because there's nothing left to do. They push you to the brink. You become so exhausted, so sick, that creating a safety bubble around yourself, or eventually going low contact or no contact, is the only way to survive. And scapegoats tend to grow up holding incredibly strong values, actually, precisely because of what we've lived through. Integrity, compassion, fairness, honesty, loyalty, responsibility, those often become core traits of who we are, not because our family taught us this, that's for sure, but because the family violated those so severely that we had to define ourselves in opposition of that chaos. And this is exactly, what the narcissistic family system will find leverage in, because they will take the best parts of you and twist them into accusation that you are actually the opposite of these things. So if you try to protect yourself by setting boundaries, they will say that you have no loyalty, that you're not family oriented. If you refuse to tolerate abusive behavior, they will say you have no compassion, even though you do. You're very sensitive. You're a very, very compassionate person. If you distance yourself from the chaos, they will say you don't care about your family, because you distance yourself from chaos that was hurting you because you were sensitive and you couldn't take it anymore. If you stop sacrificing your health to meet their emotional demands, they will accuse you of being selfish, right? If you walk away to save your life, they will say you have no values at all, and that you're like the worst kind of human being, that has no integrity or whatever, And this is projection disguised as morality. The narcissistic family needs you to feel like your self-protection is evidence of your moral failure. Because if you believed in your own goodness and your right to safety, their entire dynamic would collapse. Their control depends on your guilt and not on the truth. So they create like a false moral standard where your boundaries become cruelty. Their exploitation of you becomes family loyalty. Your healing and you're needing to take space to heal becomes family abandonment, and you are a traitor, right? Their abuse becomes discipline or concern, right? Things they had no choice to do because you're evil, bad, demonic character, Your absence becomes proof that you have no values. And this is something that you have to live with, knowing other people feel like that, think like that of you, when it's not true. And so every fiber of your body will want to fight this and go back and prove them wrong, and you compile that with the guilt, that self-doubt, that, okay, is it me? Is it me maybe? And I mean, you got yourself, you're fully controlled by toxic people. They will even claim that you are the one who lacks integrity, while they behave in ways that violate every one of your actual values. They will flip the script so effectively that the scapegoat begins to doubt their own moral compass, even though the scapegoat is typically the only person in the system who consistently acts with empathy, and conscience, And this is the trap. This is the trap. Your values, make you vulnerable to their guilt, and they use that guilt to keep you compliant, self-blaming, and small. Now, your values are not the problem. at all, and there is nothing wrong with you. Your abuse is not evidence of a failed character or whatever they're saying, okay? Your boundaries are not moral betrayals to anything or anyone. And your desire to protect yourself, your need to protect yourself, does not make you a bad person. Only dysfunctional families think like this. So if you pay attention to your body and how you feel and the trauma you've endured and the side effects of the trauma, and you feel guilty still for not going back to the place that caused it, you're dealing with guilt conditioning. So become aware of this. This is guilt conditioning. Pay attention to how it feels in your body. Where is it? Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel it in your stomach, in the solar plexus, in the jaw? Do you have images in your head where you imagine people suffering because of you? How do you experience this conditioned guilt? You have to become aware of it so that when it shows up, you can learn to control it, okay? Now, for a scapegoat, this guilt creates such a profound dilemma. Our nervous system is wired to respond, to care and empathy and fairness. We're wired to honor our values and to feel guilty when we think that we hurt someone. But in this dynamic, our moral instincts are trapped, It's like we want to act according to our values, yet the people in front of us don't play by the same rules and don't treat us well, So we become pulled in like two directions at once. Your integrity tells you that you care, your values, to protect, to be loyal. Your experience, however, tells you that acting on your instincts only exposes you to more abuse, more manipulation, more guilt. So your body, your mind, and your emotions are not designed to resolve this conflict cleanly, that tension, that collision of your values with the impossibility of reciprocal relationship with them, it's one of the reasons why guilt and anxiety become so chronic for us scapegoats. Every attempt to either appease the abuser or protect yourselves comes at a cost to our health, our peace of mind, and our sense of self. Our nervous system remembers who these family members used to be for us, not who they actually are. Okay, and this is important. Children of emotionally unavailable parents often carry a fantasy version of the parent within them. We all carry a fantasy version of what that parent could be or could have been or who we want them to be. And it's not that this is a delusional fantasy, but it's a hope. It's like a longing that maybe one day, maybe one day things can get better. So when the enablers show up and try and draw us back in, part of us may still hope that repair is possible, and part of us may feel that empathy because of what they represent to us biologically. If this is, a parent, this is a relative, and, maybe we will think, maybe this time they'll see us. Maybe they will soften with us. Maybe they will start seeing that how we feel matters too. But again and again, you'll see that they will show you again and again and again that you don't, because it's more important to them to normalize this family story than to hold accountability for what happened to you, than to have any sort of awareness of what you're experiencing, your pain, your trauma. They will put the narcissist's comfort above your well-being. And you'll see in general, from my experience, their emotional loyalty will always be aligned with the system that harmed us and that they created and that they so desperately try to maintain, so that they don't have to face any of their own real issues. So as a scapegoat, you've been taught that caring for others means putting yourself last. You've been trained to believe that setting boundaries, protecting yourself, or saying no is selfish and wrong. But the truth is that your values don't require you to sacrifice your well-being. Values like compassion, empathy, loyalty, courage, all of that, it's very beautiful. But they only have meaning when they are lived without destroying you. Protecting yourself, walking away from harm, or refusing to enable abuse does not make you a bad person. It makes you someone who honors your own integrity. Caring for someone who repeatedly harms you, dismisses you, or chooses others over you, that's not loyalty value. That's self-abandonment. And no value, no matter how deeply you hold it, obligates you to betray yourself. Your values are your strengths, but they're not chains that are meant to hold you back. They guide how you treat those who deserve your care, those who treat you well, but they're not supposed to bind you to those who abuse, manipulate, or disregard you. Now, when you feel guilty, for being unable to take care of your aging parent, or when you can't, you don't want, you feel uncomfortable going to a funeral, you feel uncomfortable doing a favor, that kind of thing, this actually reflects your values, your empathy, who you are as a person, because you're a good person, you have a good heart, you're a genuine person, but it's just that this guilt and this guilt is misplaced, it's misdirected, because applying that feeling to those who hurt you and who don't reciprocate, is harmful in the long run. It will keep you trapped, So your parent, your abusive family member, they didn't treat you as a person worthy of care, honesty, or emotional reciprocity, They did not meet you on the same level that you were trying to meet them. This mismatch between the care that we want to give and the good people that we want to be, right? Versus what we received, how we're treated, what that did to us physically, emotionally, psychologically. There's a mismatch there. And this is what causes the suffering, the chronic guilt, the self-doubt. Recognizing this mismatch is one of the most important steps towards understanding that your guilt is actually not a reflection of you failing at anything. It's a reflection of the impossibility of a relationship that was never reciprocal. So a better internal question would be, what is a compassionate thing, to do for me? How can I show compassion towards myself? Not just for them, not just for the role that you've been forced to play, not just for some moral ideal that doesn't reflect reality. What is the compassionate thing for you, for your nervous system, for your heart, for your future, for your choices, for your healing, for that little boy or girl who still lives within you and who hopes, that they will someday be heard and understood, Then sometimes the most compassionate thing that you can do is actually step back. It's limited contact. It's emotional neutrality, It's outsourcing their care to professionals, because it doesn't all have to fall on your shoulders, It's honoring the truth that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved and who does not see you, So this compassion, it starts with you, but towards yourself. And when they come after you and the guilt rises up, I do invite you to remember the crab bucket metaphor, The crab mentality is one of the most destructive human behaviors. If you place a single crab in a bucket, it will claw its way out, through up the side to escape, right? But if a group of crabs are stuck in that bucket, something else will happen. When one crab starts climbing towards freedom, the others will reach out and pull that crab back down, and none of them escape because they refuse to let the other one rise. So I think that this metaphor really applies to all the scapegoats out there. The moment that we try to climb out of the family dysfunction, to heal, to grow, to better ourselves, to simply breathe differently, the rest of the system will react. They will not celebrate your progress. They're not going to support your escape. They will try and tug you back into the same role, the same pain, the same silence, the same bucket. Because the scapegoats movements threaten the entire system. Your healing exposes a dysfunction. Your growth highlights their stagnation. Your truth disrupts their comfort. And they will use every tool they can to try and keep you in that role. And this guilt is a huge part of the tools that they will use to keep you under their control. And this guilt is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. It's a survival pattern that was handed to you. You know, the family conditioned you to feel guilty for existing, for having needs, for disagreeing, for pulling away, for simply not absorbing the family's dysfunction anymore. You know, you were taught to feel guilty for protecting yourself. You were taught to feel guilty for feeling pain that you did not cause. You were taught to feel guilty for wanting peace, and so on. So the crab mentality is not just petty jealousy. In toxic families, it becomes a survival strategy. The group maintains its illusion by keeping the scapegoat stuck at the bottom of the bucket. You are not responsible for their dysfunction. You're not required to sacrifice yourself to satisfy their illusions of what's normal. If they think that's normal, then they can do that. But I personally am not down with that. Healing as a scapegoat is not about fixing them, because we can't do that. We don't have the power to do that. They have to wake up on their own, okay? But what we can do is reclaim our lives, reclaim ourselves. Every boundary that we set, every act of self-care, every moment that we choose our own safety is proof that we're reclaiming our life. And on doing this, guilt conditioning is a huge, huge part of our healing process, becoming aware of it when it manifests so that you can control it. And, you know, just for today, in this moment right now, notice, you know, one area of your life where you've been carrying misplaced guilt. And ask yourself, what is the compassionate thing that you can do from this point on for yourself? And let that guide your next action. So I hope this helped you. And remember, I love myself, I trust myself, and I'll see you soon.